I'm standing ankle-deep in foul black mud where a pristine 47-acre lake shimmered just 3 days ago. The air is heavy with the stench of rot, dead fish, diesel slicks, and something that smells disturbingly like sewage. Every swing of my sledgehammer sends a metallic clang echoing across the wasteland, where cracked earth stretches toward the tree line like the surface of some alien planet. Scattered across this nightmare are 24 luxury boats, each worth more than most homes in this county. Their once gleaming hulls are smeared with decades of muck, stranded like dying whales on the dry lake bed. 300 yards away, Brenda Kellworth, queen of the HOA and self-appointed ruler of Willow Shores, is shrieking into her phone while blasting dust off her bone-dry swimming pools with a garden hose. Her pampered resort guests drag suitcases toward waiting SUVs, demanding refunds as bass and bluegill writhe helplessly in muddy puddles. 3 months ago, Brenda bulldozed my grandfather's bridge, called it an eyesore. 70 years of history erased while I was burying my father. Well, Brenda, how's your $2 million rustic lake experience looking now? But before I explain how I legally drained an entire lake, answer me this. What would you do if someone destroyed your family's legacy while you stood at a graveside? My name is Marcus Henley. I'm 47, divorced, broke, and fighting for custody of my kids. 3 months ago, I was just a mechanical engineer trying to hold myself together. The only refuge I had was my grandfather Ezra's cabin on Lake Willow. Ezra bought 40 acres back in 1951, what locals then called Frog Pond, for $800, his entire discharge bonus from Korea. It was a swampy 12 acres of muck back then, but Ezra saw potential where no one else did. He built the cabin with surplus Navy lumber, then a dock, and finally his masterpiece, a 70-foot wooden bridge linking our land to the main trail. Each timber was hand-picked, fitted with the precision of a man who'd learned in the trenches. That sloppy work gets people killed. That bridge became legend. Kids leapt off it every summer. Lovers carved initials into its rails. 3 generations of proposals were made under its weathered beams. By 2019, the Historical Society wanted to protect it under the state registry. The cabin still smelled like cedar and Maxwell House coffee, just as it had when Grandpa taught me to tie knots by lamplight. Every weekend, I'd escape my empty apartment and make the 2-hour drive just to breathe silence. Then Brenda arrived. 5 years ago, she blew into our quiet backwater like a phoenix storm cloud in designer heels. Claimed she'd made her fortune in real estate, though nobody ever saw proof beyond her black Amex and imported Range Rover. Within months, she snapped up the Henderson Ranch across the lake and announced Willow Shores Estates. Luxury homes, starting at $800,000, in a county where teachers made $35 grand. She crowned herself HOA president before the first house was even finished. Her jewel was Lake Vista Resort, a $2 million monument of glass, steel, and Italian marble. But her real hobby was weaponizing code enforcement, chicken coop, agricultural nuisance, fishing shack, safety hazard, and my grandfather's bridge, an unpermitted obstruction that blocked her guests' $1 million view. On October 15th, while I was lowering my father into the ground, Brenda sent an excavator to wipe out 70 years of Henley history. Diesel fumes still hung in the air when I returned that night, broken wood scattered like bones. A notice was stapled to my door. Unpermitted structure removed per Municipal Code 847B. Cleanup fee, $2,147. Have a blessed day. Footage told the story. Brenda, in her red heels, directing demolition like a general leading troop. I stormed. Into the next HOA meeting, 23 people crammed into a stuffy room, all perfumed indignation and hairspray. Brenda didn't even look at me when she said, Your bridge didn't align with community standards. It was an eyesore. Frankly, it devalued neighboring investments. Then came the vote. 7-2. I owed cleanup fees. Driving home, I saw new survey stakes hammered into my land, all stamped with her company's logo. 3 days later, a cease and desist letter arrived, signed by her son-in-law, Dale, a half-baked lawyer with a diploma from nowhere. Charges: trespassing, harassment, and my personal favorite, verbal assault, for speaking at a public meeting. The kicker? They were moving to demolish my boat launch, poured by Grandpa himself in 1953. That afternoon, I went to see Ruby Martinez, a small-town lawyer who smelled of old books and black coffee. She pulled out Ezra's yellow deed, traced the lines with a fingertip, and dropped the bombshell. When the county expanded Frog Pond into Lake Willow in 1953, they built a dam on Ezra's land. He'd granted them an easement, but he never signed away ownership rights. More importantly, under water law, those rights gave me control. Real control. But Brenda wasn't done. Friday morning, I found my dock sabotaged. Support posts sawed clean through. My fishing boat leaned sideways, taking on water. The security camera lens had been spray-painted black. Brenda had an alibi, of course, some fundraiser. But then Jake Morrison, a 22-year-old marina worker, showed up on my porch, pale as a ghost. He confessed Dale had been there that night with power tools. He even showed me texts proving Brenda's involvement. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Ruby unearthed the 1954 environmental impact study for the dam. It contained one clause no one remembered. The property owner had the right to drain the lake for emergency inspection or maintenance. The county engineer could review, but not override. My grandfather had built a nuclear option into the deed. Brenda tore down my bridge to give her guests a view, but that view depended entirely on water I controlled, and 72 hours ago, I exercised that right. Ruby had mentioned water law the first day we met. She specialized in it after watching too many developers steamroll small landowners. Her words echoed in my head now. First in time, first in right. Original riparian rights trumped zoning laws, HOA covenants, even municipal ordinances. A simple principle, sharpened like a blade. Tuesday brought Brenda's most desperate move yet. She showed up at my door in pearls and pressed slacks, smile polished like chrome, eyes cold enough to freeze fire. Flanking her were two resort guests, straight out of a country club catalog, all teeth and entitlement. "Marcus," she cooed, voice dipped in poison honey. "We need to discuss your behavior. My guests are feeling unsafe with all this hostility." Hostility meant me existing on my own land. She produced an envelope thick as a crime novel. Inside, a cashier's check for $400,000, 40% above market value, enough to vanish and start over. The paper smelled like fresh ink and desperation. "That's generous," I said, handing it back. "But this property isn't for sale." Her mask cracked just enough to show the predator beneath. "Marcus, you're fighting a war you can't win. I have resources, connections, legal firepower. You have, what, a broken-down cabin and hurt feelings?" "I've got something better," I said, thinking of the federal documents cooling on my kitchen table. "I've got time." After she left, I called Ruby with news about the compliance requirements. Her excitement vibrated through the phone. "Marcus, this isn't just about vandalism or HOA disputes. If her resort violates federal access provisions, she owes repayment of the original flood control funding, with 70 years of interest." That evening, I stood where my grandfather's bridge once crossed the water, watching Brenda's wine cruise drift into the marina. 15 guests this time, their laughter scattering across the lake. The sunset painted the surface like molten copper. Not just something I lived beside anymore, something I controlled. I called Pat Kowalski, the county engineer. If I was going to invoke emergency drainage rights, I'd need documentation no lawyer could challenge. Pat, it's Marcus Henley. We need to discuss the integrity of Lake Willow Dam. When can you inspect? Pat showed up Wednesday morning with his hard hat and clipboard, hands rough with decades of concrete and current. Ruby said you've got concerns, he muttered. Let's take a look. We walked the dam's length. From above, the concrete looked solid. Up close, 70 years of water pressure and freeze-thaw cycles told a different story. Hairline cracks spider-webbed across the spillway like wrinkles on old skin. Siltation's the real problem, Pat said, pointing to cloudy water near the marina. Boat traffic stirs up sediment faster than the lake can process. And look here. His soil samples read like a toxic confession, heavy metals, fuel runoff. Petroleum byproducts thick enough to classify sections of the lake bed as hazardous waste. The resort's speedboats had turned 47 acres of mountain water into poison. Federal guidelines require periodic drainage, Pat continued, scribbling notes. Should have been done 15 years ago. That afternoon, Brenda struck back. Flyers sprouted across town like a blight. My divorce photos stared from telephone poles and store windows, paired with cherry-picked quotes from sealed court. Documents! Headline screamed, Dangerous local threatens lake community. The phone lit up before noon. Neighbors, friends, even my ex-wife calling from Denver. Humiliation tasted like pennies and burned coffee. But Brenda had overplayed. Thursday morning, Deputy Williams knocked at my door. He held a flyer like evidence. Marcus, did you authorize release of these records? Hell no, they're sealed. He folded the flyer, jaw tight. That's a felony. Harassment, too. You want to press charges? While the sheriff opened a criminal case, Pat's official report landed on my desk, stamped, notarized, irrefutable. Lake Willow Dam structurally sound but requires immediate environmental remediation. Recommend temporary drainage within 60 days to remove toxins. And then Pat dropped the bombshell. That marina was built without federal wetland impact studies. No permits, no assessments. She never filed. Ruby's earlier warning about successor liability clicked into place. New owners inherited every violation, meaning Brenda was on the hook for decades of unfiled compliance. By Pat's calculations, repayment of the 1954 flood control grant plus penalties, about $850,000. Friday evening, I watched another of Brenda's wine cruises slide into the marina. 20 guests this time, laughter carrying across water that wasn't hers. My phone buzzed. Jake, the dockhand. Weekend fully booked. Fishing tournament Saturday, wedding Sunday. Perfect. Saturday morning dawned sharp as glass. Ruby's office had turned into a war room, maps and legal files covering every surface. She handed me brittle, yellow documents from a forgotten state archive box. Filed under federal compliance, 1950 to 1960. No one's touched them in 40 years. The 1954 expansion wasn't just local flood control. It was part of an Army Corps of Engineers project spanning 3 counties. Funding came with handcuffs. Any commercial development affecting the water had to maintain public access. Violate. That, and the entire grant had to be repaid, compounded annually. Ruby's finger tapped Section 7. 70 years of interest, Marcus. Conservative estimate, $2.3 million. And worse, Brenda's marina sat on federally protected wetlands. No permits, no impact studies, a $2 million resort built on a crime scene. Successor liability meant she inherited it all. The true weapon, though lay buried in subsection 12. Emergency Drainage Authority. My grandfather had secured it in 1954. If environmental contamination threatened the ecosystem, the dam owner could drain the lake immediately. No hearings, no injunctions. Federal law signed in ink older than Brenda's entire empire. Ruby leaned across the desk, eyes sharp as glass. She can fight you for years in civil court, but she can't fight this. Pat's contamination report gives you bulletproof justification. Jake confirmed the timing. Resort's biggest weekend yet. 30 grand in revenue on the line. 72. Hours notice required, Ruby said, smiling like a general watching the enemy walk into a kill zone. File Monday morning. Let her have one last perfect weekend, then drain her kingdom. Pat walked me through the mechanics. The original dam's design was simple, rugged. Manual crank system, no electricity required, 3-stage process, 6 inches in the first hour to concentrate fish, then 12 more hours to drain the main basin, finishing with a full evacuation. Through the emergency spillway. 24 hours start to finish, fast enough to prevent her lawyers from getting an injunction. Long enough to rescue wildlife before the lake bottom turned to mud. Ruby notarized the filings with the precision of a surgeon. Federal environmental notices, county drainage permits, liability waivers. The beauty of emergency authority, she said, pressing her seal to the page, is that it overrides everything else. Zoning codes, HOA rules, even judges. Federal contamination law trumps it all. By Monday, the paperwork would be filed, the clock would start, and Brenda Kelworth's empire would be living on borrowed time. I remembered a story she once told me from law school, a dairy farmer who drained a polluted pond despite resistance from 3 municipalities and a state agency. He'd won because his paperwork was flawless and his science undeniable. Pat's contamination report gave us both. By Tuesday, reinforcements arrived. Dr. Sarah Olivia from the State Wildlife Department rolled up with holding tanks and volunteers ready to relocate every fish in Lake Willow. Environmental circles had been watching the lake for years, waiting for their chance. Your resort's boat traffic has pushed this ecosystem past recovery, she said, collecting water samples destined for federal court. Temporary drainage is exactly what it needs. The fish rescue would provide perfect optics, cameras preferred restoration stories over HOA vendettas. Wednesday night, I walked the length of the dam with a flashlight. My grandfather had kept this place alive with oil cans and stubborn patience. The manual crank system was elegant 1950s engineering, pure function over complexity. A shot of WD-40, and the release moved smooth as silk. The smell of machine oil and lake water filled the air as each mechanism answered my test. Warning valve. Operational, main gate ready, emergency spillway waiting to swallow 47 acres of poisoned water. Meanwhile, updates poured in. Ruby secured an environmental reporter who framed the story as heroic lake restoration versus greedy development. Dr. Olivia's crews scheduled the fish rescue for Friday. Pat lined up county emergency services for Saturday. The whole thing ticked like clockwork. Thursday night, in my grandfather's cabin, I read his last maintenance logs. His final entry 3 weeks before his death made my throat tighten. The lake remembers its natural state. Someday, someone will help it. Find that memory again. Ezra had left me not just a dam, but a mandate. Use the authority not as a weapon, but as an environmental reset. Friday was supposed to bring cameras, inspectors, and the beginning of Brenda's downfall. Instead, it brought black SUVs. I was checking the warning valve when they rolled into my driveway. Brenda, her lawyer son-in-law Dale, and 2 men built like mercenaries in polo shirts. Their leader introduced himself with a handshake like granite. Rick Stevenson, Northwood Security. We're here to prevent terrorist activity against critical infrastructure. Terrorist. Brenda had labeled me a terrorist for touching my own dam. She stood in front of the controls like a general. This structure provides water security for the community. Any sabotage falls under the Patriot Act. Dale handed me an emergency injunction as thick as a phone book. Federal seal, legal jargon stacked like bricks, and the threat of 10 years in prison. But the timestamp stank. "This was filed yesterday," I said. "You got a federal order in 18 hours?" Dale's smile faltered. "Judge Morrison understood the urgency. He's family. Jake's uncle." The lock clicked open in my mind. Pure corruption. Ruby countered that afternoon with the precision of artillery. "This injunction is fraudulent," she said. "Judge Morrison retired last month. He has no authority." She had found something. Better than fraud. Brenda's financial empire was laced with bribes, permits, zoning variances, environmental waivers, all purchased like groceries. And that injunction was just another item on the receipt. The FBI doesn't ignore federal corruption, especially when it touches infrastructure. By Friday evening, the private contractors learned they had no authority here. Sheriffs, deputies rolled up, and Williams made it clear, "Ms. Kelworth, you and your men are trespassing. Leave or face arrest." The mercenaries evaporated, leaving Brenda in my driveway with an expression sour enough to curdle milk. Saturday brought the media circus. Dr. Olivia's fish rescue gave the cameras gold, volunteers hauling bass and bluegill into clean tanks while explaining ecosystem collapse. Brenda screamed at microphones, "This is environmental terrorism. He's draining the lake out of spite." But the journalists had already read Pat's contamination report and Ruby's evidence. One correspondent asked her about illegally dumping pollutants into federally protected waters. Brenda's response required network sensors. By noon, federal investigators were combing her paperwork. Agent Patricia Hayes from the EPA's Criminal Division carried herself like someone who had spent a career prosecuting environmental crime. After reviewing Pat's data, she looked at me. "Your drainage plan isn't just legal. It's necessary. This lake has been poisoned for years." Meanwhile, Brenda's resort weekend unraveled. Guests demanded refunds, a wedding party threatened to sue, and Jake texted updates. Brenda locked in her office, screaming at lawyers. Sunday evening, I stood by the dam controls, watching Brenda's final wine cruise drift across water that would not exist in 18 hours. 22 guests laughed over champagne, oblivious to the industrial runoff beneath them. The manual crank fit perfectly in my palm. 70 years of maintenance had kept it ready for this. But Sunday night brought Brenda's dirtiest move. Yet my phone rang at 11:30. Sarah. My ex-wife never called this late unless it was serious. Her voice was taut with anger and fear. "A woman came to my door tonight," she said. "Offered me 50 grand to testify that you're an unfit father." Blonde, expensive clothes, white Range Rover. Brenda herself. She'd driven 6 hours to weaponize my custody record. The plan was obvious. Drag me into an emergency family hearing in Denver Monday morning. I'd missed the drainage deadline, giving her time to summon real federal intervention. But Sarah had recorded everything. She admitted to bribing witnesses in a federal case, she said. My ex-wife might not love me anymore, but she hated bullies. I told her to send the recording to Ruby. By Monday dawn, the lakefront was a siege zone. Media crews lined the access road like vultures, their dishes tilted skyward. Ruby arrived armed with fresh paperwork, EPA approval, Army Corps authorization, and liability shields strong enough to repel any lawsuit. "The FBI wants that recording," she said. "It's conspiracy to obstruct federal investigation." At 6, Pat arrived with county authorization. Dr. Olivia rolled in with her teams and hard science. Everything was legal, airtight, documented. By 7, Brenda cracked. She showed up at the dam in silk pajamas under a fur coat, hair flying like a scarecrow's in the wind, shrieking threats that would have needed heavy censoring on TV. Behind her shuffled Dale and two exhausted environmental lawyers who looked as if they'd been dragged to their own execution. "You can't do this," she screamed at the cameras. "This is my lake, my investment, my life's work." I held up the original 1951 deed, its paper browned with age for every lens to see. "Actually," I said, "this is my grandfather's lake. You've just been borrowing it." Agent Hayes stepped forward, handcuffs catching the sun like jewelry. "Brenda Kelworth, you're under arrest for conspiracy to bribe federal witnesses, obstruction of an environmental investigation, and violation of water protection statutes." The sight of Brenda being shoved into the back of an FBI sedan, designer pajamas flapping, screaming about property rights, would have been comedy gold if it hadn't been so pathetic. At 8 a.m., I gripped the iron crank my grandfather installed 70 years ago. It was warm in my palm, sun-heated, polished by decades of use. Cameras clicked like mechanical insects as I spoke. This isn't about revenge. This is about restoration. Sometimes you have to drain something completely before it can be clean again. The valve opened with a deep metallic clank, echoing across 47 poisoned acres. The water began to fall, 6 inches an hour, exactly as Ezra Henley designed. Behind me, resort guests discovered that their luxury escape had just turned into an environmental crime scene. Boats tilted, swimming pools cracked, $1 million toys became federal evidence. Justice, it turned out, flowed like water, slow at first, then all at once. By 10 a.m., the lake had dropped 3 feet, exposing decades of rot hidden under Brenda's polished surface. First came the batteries, dozens of them, scattered like toxic gravestones. Then oil drums, containers of chemicals, enough petroleum waste to qualify for a Superfund site. Channel 7's environmental correspondent whispered into her mic, fighting a gag reflex. "This isn't a lake. It's a hazardous waste dump." EPA investigators swarmed the exposed bed, scooping soil, photographing barrels. Brenda's empire was unraveling in front of the world's cameras. By noon, the $1 million yachts sat on mud like beached whales, their white hulls dripping black sludge. Resort guests clutched champagne flutes, stunned. A wedding party arrived at 1 p.m., expecting mountain views, and instead found a wasteland. The bride screamed at Dale. I called from the dam, "Ma'am, I know some lawyers, just don't hire." Anyone named Kelworth. By 2, CNN had rolled in with satellite trucks. Their correspondent, a sharp-eyed woman who'd made a career exposing polluters, shoved a mic toward me. "Critics say this is revenge. What do you say?" I pointed to the sludge-coated drums and the EPA crew cataloging crimes older than most of us. "We're not draining a lake," I said. "We're exposing a crime scene." The soundbite hit like lightning. By 3, Sheriff Williams arrived with an arrest warrant for Dale, who'd been found hiding in a wine cellar with cash and falsified permits. Watching him walked past Brenda's ruined marina while furious wedding guests demanded refunds was live TV gold. At 4, investigators uncovered the smoking gun, an illegal sewage pipe funneling resort waste straight into the lake. Contamination. Levels redlined the instruments. Agent Hayes looked stricken. "This is the worst environmental crime I've seen in 20 years, she told the cameras. "These people aren't business owners, they're environmental terrorists." By 5, Dr. Olivia's rescue crews had relocated over 10,000 fish. Healthy ones would return. Diseased ones would sit in evidence bags. At 6, the last of the water slipped away. For the first time in 70 years, the bones of Willow Creek lay exposed. Native arrowheads, rusted farm tools, the skeleton of the land my grandfather had once promised to protect. The sun dropped over the barren basin, turning the cracked mud copper red. The ruined resort sat perched above it like some absurd monument to greed. Children played in the revealed creek bed, while their grandparents told stories about a time before Brenda's empire, when the springs ran clear and gold dust still swirled in the shallows. 30 days later, I stood on my grandfather's rebuilt bridge and listened to the sound I'd dreamed about for months: clean water lapping against a natural shore. The lake was filling again, this time pure, this time permanent. The Kelworth Empire had collapsed. Brenda faced conspiracy, bribery, and environmental terrorism charges. Dale, too, plus forgery and obstruction. Both stared down decades in prison. The resort decayed, nature reclaiming it piece by piece. Weeds cracked marble floors once polished for her parties. Wind howled through broken glass. Thanksgiving brought the unveiling of Ezra Henley Memorial Crossing. The whole town turned out, carrying food, hammering nails, telling stories about a man who'd loved water more than wealth. My kids, finally, free from Brenda's grip, spent their summer swimming and fishing in a lake so clean you could drink from it. Tourists returned, not for marble lobbies, but for stars, firewood, and trout. Fishermen came from 3 states. Local businesses thrived. I created a conservation scholarship in my grandfather's name. The first recipient, Tommy Morrison, brother of the boy we'd lost who wanted to engineer pollution prevention systems. By the next year, Willow was a model for restoration. Universities studied it. Federal agencies cited it. Dr. Olivia published breakthrough research on how temporary drainage could save dying lakes. The government declared it permanently protected, shielded from corporate hands forever. This evening, I stood on the bridge as the sunset bled across the refilled waters. Pine air filled my lungs. For the first time in decades, the water smelled clean, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Ezra laughing, his sanctuary at last restored.